This is the morning brief from the Economic Times.
Access denied. Access granted. Access granted.
Big Brother is watching you. It's a phrase we've occasionally joked about and more often debated over, with mobile phones and apps becoming so entwined in our daily lives to be virtually inseparable. We were reminded how vulnerable we are because of these devices by the revelations that the mobile phones of heads of state, politicians, journalists, and activists in countries including India could have been potential targets of an extensive hacking and surveillance operation carried out by a spyware called Pegasus. What makes this particularly chilling is the fact that Pegasus can't be bought by just about anybody. It's sold by the Israeli company NSO only to government agencies and allegedly to tackle crime and terrorism. In India, the list of 300 possible targets include Congress leader Rahul Gandhi, a former election commissioner, a virologist, and journalists. Amidst France and Israel announcing probes into NSO in the wake of the recent expose, the cybersecurity firm has said Pegasus and similar technologies help law enforcement agencies prevent and investigate crime and terrorism, and that the company does not operate the Pegasus technology or have access to the data collected by its clients. But the explosive revelations brought out by news organizations like the WION in India and the Guardian in the UK, and led by France's Forbidden Stories and Amnesty International, has thrown up several questions. From how Pegasus works, to who has ordered its use in India, to whether our laws can provide any recourse, and finally, how vulnerable we are today because of technology. In today's episode, you'll be hearing from a lawyer and a cybersecurity journalist about this, as well as a journalist who has reported on what India Inc. has been doing in the wake of the Pegasus project expose to protect themselves. From the Economic Times, I'm Indulekha Aravind, and you're listening to the Morning Brief. Among the many questions swirling around the Pegasus expose are what sets this spying apart from previous attempts. Because surveillance by itself is of course not new, whether it was the Watergate scandal under President Nixon in the US, or closer home, the surveillance of the phones of lobbyist Neera Radia.
President Richard Nixon made public the smoking gun, the transcript of a tape recording that showed that he approved the cover-up of the Watergate break-in. 4 days later, Nixon resigned.
Radia, a high-profile lobbyist for some of the biggest names in corporate India, including the Tata Group and Reliance, has emerged as the face of the 2G scam. The CBI is examining close to 6,000 phone conversations between Radia and a range of politicians, industrialists and others.
I asked Vrinda Bhandari, a lawyer in Delhi working on privacy issues and digital rights, why Pegasus is different.
I think what is different is that this is not the case of traditional surveillance, like you're talking about Watergate or Neera Radia. We are talking about a malware or a spyware that was installed in a user's phone that can look at all the contents of their phone, and it can take control of the phone through what is called a zero-click attack. So it means without any action from the user, the phone can be hacked. So this is not surveillance, this is hacking. Now, under the Information Technology Act, when you have surveillance, you can intercept a phone conversation. And that's what we traditionally understand as, phone tapping. But Pegasus is about taking control of the phone. And so to that extent, it is not surveillance. I mean, although we talk about it in the framework of surveillance, it really is a case of hacking. And I think in general, what is important to understand about surveillance measures today is they are very different from the Watergate style surveillance measures because of the development of technology. So big data and technology has just made it easier to cast the net of surveillance much wider and deeper than it used to be.
When I put the same question to my colleague Nirmal John, editor of cybersecurity at ET Prime, he pointed out that while surveillance itself, like I mentioned, is an old story, what was new this time was the tool, Pegasus.
The power of the tool is the story here. Now, there is a reason why such powerful tools have come into existence over the last decade or so, and it goes back to the Snowden revelations back earlier in this decade.
Even if you're not doing anything wrong, you're being watched and recorded. And the storage capability of these systems increases every year consistently by orders of magnitude, to where it's getting to the point you don't have to have done anything wrong. You simply have to eventually fall under suspicion from somebody, even by a wrong call. And then they can use the system to go back in time and scrutinize every decision you've ever made.
I had in fact reached out to Nirmal to try and understand how the spyware was able to get to the devices of the targets. Here's what he said.
The earliest version of Pegasus that we know of was primarily spread through what is known as spear phishing. So if I needed to target you, Indulekha, I sent you a message with a link. On clicking the link, the spyware would install itself on your system or your phone and then do its thing, right? But I think the biggest transformation from the latest revelations is that has changed. It's not the only way to actually infect a system. There are multiple ways right now. One is through what is called tapping into zero-day vulnerabilities, where you don't have to necessarily click on anything. Zero-day vulnerabilities basically are vulnerabilities in the operating system level itself, which whether it's Android or Apple, iOS, which Apple or Google has not fixed yet. And these vulnerabilities often are powerful enough to let these agencies which snoop right through, and they can then target your phone and install such spyware, right? The scariest part about that is that there is little that you can do about it.
When I asked him if Pegasus was the most potent or powerful spyware tool out there, his reply was far from reassuring.
I think the portion that you need to underline is whether you've heard about it or not. We know about Pegasus. There might be other tools. There are certainly other tools that, one has heard of over the past few years writing about it. There was a tool called Celebrite. It was, I think, a US tool. There was something called as FinFisher. There was something called a Cyberbit. So we don't know the extent of what is out there, frankly. Right? These are not consumer level applications which are marketed in that sense. Right? So these are things which are marketed to intelligence agencies and government. So there is very little information which is available at the moment on whether this is the most powerful tool that's available. This is certainly the most powerful tool that's available that we know of.
One of the most disturbing aspects of the Pegasus revelations is the fact that the spyware, as I mentioned earlier, is sold only to the agencies of vetted governments, which makes us question who ordered the hacking of phones of journalists and judges, and even someone like virologist Gagandeep Kang in India. The Indian government maintains that there has been no unauthorized interception, with the new IT Minister Ashwini Vaishnaw telling Parliament that unauthorized surveillance cannot occur, while Home Minister Amit Shah has alleged that the news reports are the work of disruptors.
Amit Shah wrote a post questioning the timing of this leak, saying, "People have often associated this phrase with me in light of WION, but today I want to seriously say the timing, the selective leaking and the disruptions. Aap chronology samajhiye." This is a report by the disruptors of the obstructors, and disruptors are globally organizations which do not like India or their progress.
Vrinda points out that the government has not categorically denied that it has been a client of NSO or used Pegasus, and says their response raises more questions than answers.
So I think the government's response raises more questions than it answers because it is so vague and obfuscatory. Now, what is the meaning of quote unquote unauthorized surveillance or authorized interception, which is the other term they've used? Who has authorized this surveillance? Or, when they say that no unauthorized surveillance has taken place, it means that the surveillance has been authorized. Now, who has authorized it? Under what provision of law has it been authorized? It's important to note that the government has not issued a blanket denial where they've rejected the claims that have emerged in the last week. So, we are led to believe that there is some truth to the reporting. But the important fact to remember is an authorized interception does not necessarily make it legal. And although this is a slightly legal argument, so bear with me. And this is because under Section 69 of the Information and Technology Act, anything that has to be authorized can only be done in the case of public emergency or public safety. It has to be done in the interest of national security, public order, to prevent the commission of a cognizable offense. If you look at the list of people who have potentially been targeted, I'm not sure how the standard of public emergency or public safety has been met. So has Gagandeep Kang, what public emergency or public safety concerns are raised with her phone tapping? And that's why I think we have to ask three questions. Is it authorized? If so, by whom? Even if it is authorized, is it legal under the provisions of Section 69 of the Information Technology Act? So was there a public emergency? Was a written order passed? Was a 3-member review committee constituted to oversee the order and check that it complied? And then, I guess, which the society has to ask a larger question, that even if it is authorized and legal, is it justified? And is this the kind of society that we want to live in? So what has happened in this case? I think that is why some form of accountability is needed for the people. I mean, this is a democracy run, by the people, for the people, of the people. So I think the people need answers.
No, absolutely. And coming to the question again of accountability, what is the recourse that those who, so far been targeted by Pegasus in India have under the law? Do they have any kind of redressal mechanism that they can use?
They have some redressal mechanisms, definitely. How effective they are is a separate question. So first, coming to what are the redressal mechanisms, there is a provision to file a police complaint. Like I've mentioned, this is a case of hacking because the contents of their phone has been hacked. There is what in the definition of the Information Technology Act is a computer contamination that has happened. So they can file a police complaint. Of course, the problem becomes who is the accused, right? So the police would have to conduct certain investigations to find out, first to be able to demonstrate and verify that the phone was actually infected with the Pegasus spyware, then to follow the trail, so to speak, to determine who authorized that action. And so whether that would really work in practice, I'm not so sure. I'm not sure the police would have either the technical capabilities or the ability to find the answers to these questions. The second recourse is obviously to file a petition in court. That's also possible, where you can ask for a judicial inquiry, you can ask for a SIT to be constituted and ask the government to provide certain answers on affidavit. I think in both these cases, the one issue is going to be to demonstrate facts. And that is why it is important that the people who have been targeted have all the support that they need, because it is going to be essentially very important to demonstrate what has happened to them. Having said that, I think it is also important to notice, and especially for any judicial recourse, this becomes important, that whether or not their phone was finally tapped, was finally hacked, and whether spyware was infected, was added to their phone. I think the really important question is the chilling effect this has created. So the knowledge that something may have entered their phone, the knowledge that they may be under 24/7 surveillance in itself creates a chilling effect, which has a downstream effect on the work of journalists, on the work of activists, on the work of protesters, on the work of politicians, judges, everybody. And so I think, especially if someone is considering a judicial recourse, it becomes very important to also look at establishing the chilling effect that is there because of the fear of surveillance.
An offshoot of the Pegasus hacking scandal was the chilling effect that it's also had on corporate India, as my colleague Sachin reported in ET earlier. Sachin told me that some companies had been sufficiently spooked to immediately try and ring-fence at least their leadership's devices.
While most of them are spooked, only a handful are going all out and taking the matters in their hands. So, one of the largest conglomerates in India has given new iPhones to its top 150 executives. These executives can't download any apps on these phones. Not just that, one could only make or receive phone calls. That too through a server. So this server would be kind of a buffer server that sits between the phone as well as the telecom company. So every time there is a call or a message, it would first go through the protected server. In another instance, another large company has roped in one of the big four firms and a small tech startup to get the vulnerability test done.
Very interesting. And from what you've heard in your discussions, is it corporate espionage that's at the back of their minds, or is it like foreign governments, whether they are listening in, or what's the concerns that they've told you is worrying them?
The first obvious concern is corporate espionage, especially the ones backed by foreign governments. That seems to be the worry. In the past few years, Indian companies in technology, pharma, and banking space have been at the receiving end of a systematic attack from Chinese hackers. Some of the largest tech players have been really cautious and are going as far as not using any Chinese hardware in their product offering as well.
Two reports hint at potential cyber warfare by China, with Chinese hackers allegedly targeting critical Indian infrastructure and assets, from India's power grid to even the vaccine makers of the country.
The second concern is data. Now, many Indian companies have sensitive data, not just around the projects or around what they are doing, but even financial data on them. In the past, we have seen that quarter results of companies were leaked beforehand on WhatsApp groups. There were SEBI and RBI investigations too on that, but nothing concrete came out of it. No major company or bank would want such an embarrassment again. Finally, the third concern is also around criminals or the hackers getting into the system and stealing it for their own benefit. In last 18 months or so, some of the largest companies were hit by cyber attack or spywares, where their data was stolen or their systems locked and compromised. In some cases, cyber criminals have even managed to extort money from Indian companies.
While the more aware companies might be concerned over Pegasus and the prospect of similar attacks, what's become evident is that not everyone seems to understand how worrying these attempts are. In fact, one argument that you might also have heard seems to be that since big tech is anyway tracking us via Facebook and Google, why is Pegasus such a big deal? I posed the question to the experts, Vrinda and John, who said this was a false equivalence that's being made out.
So the thing is that big tech has a lot of power in our lives, and it is absolutely important that big tech is regulated. But as I've mentioned previously and in my writings as well, at the end of the day, Facebook cannot come into my house and arrest me. A Facebook or a WhatsApp or a Twitter cannot register an FIR against me. They do not have the power of criminal law. They do not have a monopoly over violence. And hence, any big tech company cannot, at the end of the day, intimidate and deter me using the power of the law. And Unfortunately, that is what the state has the power. And we know that's how the state works. So the monopoly of power that the state has is what is relevant. Because at the end of the day, the state is also the biggest data collector. Yes, big tech has a lot of power over all of us, but the state has access to all our intimate information, and it is the only entity that can legally access this information. And that's why I think the bigger concern is the state, because of the monopoly of violence that they have and because of the centralization of power that they have. However, having said that, it's very important to note that I'm not saying that this means that big tech should not be regulated. And in fact, I think when you look at the demands for pushing for a data protection law, it is because, at least against the state, one has constitutional writ remedies available. So you can go to a court very easily alleging violation of fundamental rights. But when you talk about big tech, you don't have the same strong statutory protections. And that's why we need a data protection law. And I don't think calling for regulation of big tech and calling for surveillance reform for the state are contradictory. I think they both, in fact, further the goal of improving privacy protections for citizens.
It is 100% false equivalency because I think, any digital platform has the ability to collect data, right? So there will be some amount of data being collected, right? I think the fundamental question here is how much power the person collecting the tool has to affect your life. With Facebook and Google, the impact that what they can do with their information, right? Their interest is commercial, primarily at least. With governments, I think there are far more things that are, especially depending on who is being surveilled, journalists, opposition leaders, people in power. So the sheer impact of government surveillance, government-led surveillance, intelligence agencies surveilling people, I think that is what is the worrying part, right? Now, this has always been happening, but in a country like India, which doesn't have surveillance law, which has been passed by the legislature, where you need a process to actually go ahead and, if there is a security issue, get a warrant and then survey. That process has not necessarily been established in the digital age. And I think that is where the problem is. It's really not just about surveillance, but who surveils and what they're going to use it for.
I went back to Nirmal to ask what folks like you and I could do if there was a chance that we might be targets of surveillance, or even if we aren't, to understand some of the precautions we could take. He suggested keeping phones updated and using password manager apps, though he underlined that you might need to check whether these password tool companies are from a relatively secure country or not.
See, there are a whole bunch of things that anybody, frankly, should do. One is actually to keep your phone or any system updated. I think that is probably one of the biggest things you can do. Now, in this particular case with Pegasus, even if you had the latest OS installed, they could still get in. But nonetheless, for the wide variety of malware which is out there, for the 99.99% of the malware which is out there, I think just keeping your system updated, it's the simplest thing. Every time you get a notification that there is a latest version available, do press on install now. That is one of the first things you can do. Secondly, I always recommend using a password tool rather than trying to remember all the passwords and all. What I personally do is I remember only certain passwords which I need to remember. Otherwise, for most of my things, I use a password tool which will help me with remembering those passwords, because password manager tools are designed to generate difficult passwords, and for most of your stuff, that's all you need, frankly. Other than that, it's always a good idea to run an antivirus check every now and then, the usual stuff. Cyber hygiene, as we call it, is what needs to be practiced essentially.
I had one final question to Vrinda, a question that should be important to each of us who cares about democracy. The unfortunate truth is that surveillance and privacy relatively more esoteric, I would say, than issues of the roti kapda makan or quote unquote development. Could you explain to our listeners why the ordinary voter or any mobile phone user should care about this issue?
Maybe the ordinary person doesn't care about it as much. And I think they should for three reasons. It's because of the undemocratic use, the unprecedented magnitude, and the unreasonable invasion into privacy that Pegasus has demonstrated. Let me elaborate. So the undemocratic use here is because what happened in Pegasus or in any surveillance reform is that these actions are taken without any transparency. There is no accountability, and in Pegasus' case, without any legal backing. The unprecedented magnitude, when we talk about a surveillance in a Pegasus-style form, is about the sheer number of people who are reportedly on these lists, whether you're talking about biologists, journalists, activists, whoever. And the unreasonable invasion into privacy is because Pegasus was a case of hacking and not just surveillance. And I think if we don't raise our voices at this moment, when we see so many people, quote unquote, people like us or people in the more mainstream are also getting targeted, we are never going to raise our voices. And if this does not shock people, and if citizens now don't demand an inquiry and to know the true facts, I think that if there is no public reckoning, we will lose the opportunity to ever have surveillance reform. And so even when we talk about surveillance, I think surveillance has different forms. So you have surveillance from the state, you have surveillance from big tech, and then you can have surveillance from the family, where a woman's access to her mobile phone is heavily regulated, and the content of her chats or social interactions are also regulated by the family. And the other last point I want to make is this argument that I have nothing to hide means that I do not care about privacy is very misconceived, because under this view, only people who have something to hide or those who've done something wrong are concerned about the loss of privacy. We can decide who we share our information with and who we share our private thoughts with. And all of us cherish private spaces so that we can, do and be as we want, free from the gaze of others. And I think it's for all of these reasons that even though privacy is seen as maybe a bit more esoteric and not as direct as roti, kapda or makan, I think the harms are still both instrumental and intrinsic, which is a loss of dignity, autonomy, and instrumental if it's used against you in a certain way, if it can lead to shaming, if it can lead to blackmail, extortion, all of those reasons.
This is not the first time Pegasus is in the news for being used to spy on people. In 2019, human rights activists and lawyers in India were alerted by WhatsApp that they might have been possible targets of the spyware. But despite the outcry, there was no tangible outcome of what was a shocking and dangerous violation of privacy by a tool allegedly sold only to governments. Right now, the opposition is up in arms in Parliament over Pegasus, and petitions have been filed in the Supreme Court. It's critical for the health of our democracy that these revelations must not die another silent death. And in case you still think this is not something that affects you and me, it's useful to remember those famous words of the German theologian Martin Niemöller. We should speak out before there's no one left to speak for us. You've been listening to the Morning Brief from the Economic Times, and I'm Indulekha Arvind. Today's episode was edited and coordinated by Shashwat Mohanty. Please write in with your feedback to the Morning Brief at timesgroup.com. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and have a great day. All the clips in this episode belong to the respective owners. The credits can be found in the description.